I drove in this morning and it was raining, and I have to drive somewhere this afternoon, and there were things that were left undone from yesterday. And I walked across the parking lot in the rain with about 50 different things going on in my brain and different thoughts. And I walked through that front door, and you've created a place here that is a place of peace, that has a sweet spirit to it, that is open. And all of those thoughts, I don't know how you all did this, but we need to bottle it. But it kind of fell away. And so thank you for the community that you've created here. It really is, you can sense the spirit of community here. It's sad, but this morning I want to start off by talking about a lack of a sense of community, a lack of a sense of peace, a lack of a sense of openness. 15 months ago or 17 months ago, I was having a drink with someone from Texas Pubic Radio, Jim Daglish, and we were talking about our world and how loud it was and how violent it was, how angry it was. And Jim said, you know, it's funny, National Public Radio has been given an opportunity to do this really cool project to tell everyone in their nationwide community to dare to listen to one another. But they don't think they can do it because it's too difficult. It's too challenging. It's too political. And that really bothered me. So it's too difficult. It's too challenging. It's too political for us to listen to one another. How in the world did we get there? Jim and I talked about it. It's the economic crisis of 02 and 08 has made people fearful about the future. I hear that. 9/11, the continuing violence that we have in our country. I've almost, by the way, said senseless violence, but all violence is senseless. But this violence that we see every day, the constancy of stuff that comes at us. Just like I walked in this morning with a split spirit thinking of this, that, and the other, but 24/7 we can engage with any sort of news, any sort of noise, which is really what it is, that we want to, and it leaves people feeling threatened, disconcerted, fearful, powerless, all of these different things. And what I really want to talk today about are just two things which are my listening journey. And I wish it was a prettier story than it is, but I will tell you where I am and where I have been. And then I'd also like to talk a little bit about what I've resolved to do about my inability to listen. I started off like I think most of us started off as a 3- and 4-year-old. I was completely open to the world, curious, wanted to know everything about everything. My sister's grandson, a little guy named Mike, and Mike is the most curious fellow in the world, but he calls me Uncle Dennis, but he'll say, Uncle Dennis, so clouds are white, sky is blue, why is that? And Michael, I don't know. Well, what do you think? Well, Michael, I really don't, I'm sorry, I don't have a thought on that. Well, could you make a guess? But I mean, Michael is curious about the world, and as 3- and 4-year-olds, weren't we all? Don't I wish as a 62-year-old that I was as curious then as don't I wish that I was today as curious as I was then? You get into middle school, you get into 5th, 6th, 7th grade, and we continue to absorb, but we start to pick up opinions, and we start to think about how the world is structured But it's amazing how many times we veer off and people are capable of turning us completely in an instant from one view to another. I was over listening to a lecture at the University of Texas at San Antonio, UTSA. The woman was a brilliant woman. She was a statistician, a tenured professor at Princeton. She was talking about the Robin Hood laws, where we have school districts with great tax bases and we have school districts whose tax bases aren't so great. How we share money, what the demographics of that are. Great speaker. The question and answer session wasn't so much fun. They had invited all the statistics classes in. So it was totally above my head as to what the coefficient of the something or other was. But somebody asked her a question and said, "Doctor, you grew up in the Valley, so how did a girl from the Valley become a tenured professor at Princeton?" And she said, "That's kind of interesting. I was in the 5th grade and I knew what my life was going to be. My parents and I had talked about it. I was going to be a hairdresser. And my dad said I could start in his garage, and in our neighborhood, that was a pretty good life plan. Not even slightly unusual, but my parents were interested in me being a success, and they had confidence that we could do this together." And my teacher in 5th grade came and she looked over at my shoulder and she looked at my work and she said, "You're so smart. You are so smart. Where are you going to go to college?" And I, of course, said, "Well, girls in my neighborhood, we don't go to college. I'm going to be a hairdresser. My dad's already said I can start in the garage." And she said, "Oh, no. You could get a scholarship. You could go to college. You could be anything you want to be." And she said my entire worldview changed. Because someone with a broader vision than I had shared that vision with me at a time when I was completely open to that idea, jeepers, everything changed for me. And that's the way we were at that time. I wish I could tell you that in high school and college I was open to ideas. I was a philosophy major in college, so you would have thought that I was open to everything. But from a social standpoint, that's a tough time of life, and it's a time of life where we feel all sorts of different things going. And that's when I began to close off. And that's when I began to say, I have learned this, and I'm a fairly smart fellow, and I know it, and therefore it's right. And if you agree with me, you are also a smart person. And if you don't, draw your own conclusion. So I make that confession to you simply because it's true. I had lots of ideas about lots of things. I was not always right, but as they say, never in doubt. Changed a little bit. I moderated slightly in my 30s as I began to raise children. I discovered that my parents actually did know a few things. But this process of thinking everything there is to know, and I don't claim I thought that, but I was pretty confident in my views. I find that on this journey, I've become more and more convinced that I am the one that should be talking and that others should be listening. And over the last 2 or 3 years, particularly through the foundation's work and listening to people, and particularly, and I love what was said today, listening to people's stories, I've simply learned that my approach, wherever it came from, wasn't correct. And it's not right. And I have so much more to learn than I could ever possibly realize. And so the question to me became, through this Dare to Listen campaign, is how am I going to change myself? We can do a lot of things in this world, guys, but when you get right down to it, the place that I can be most effective is simply working on me. It's a lifelong process. I'm not Catholic, but I love Pope Francis, and he said in response to a very difficult theological question, At least I assume it's a difficult theological question for him. I'm not actually positive about that. But too difficult. He said, maybe I'll get to that question someday, but I'm still working on myself. And so as I continue my faith journey, as I continue to explore myself, as I continue to seek God, well, I'll work on myself first, and I'll worry about these other, he didn't say highfalutin, but it's kind of what he said, highfalutin spiritual issues second. He may be right about that. I have my little notepad here. So I should be keeping up with myself a little bit, but what do we need to do? How do I heal in my journey? How do I become more open in my life? One of them is simply the attitude which I take towards everything. I saw so much of it reflected in your service this morning. But a spirit of openness, a sense that things are right in the world, that we can have an election result that we agree with, disagree with. We can have troubles in the Middle East, we can troubles elsewhere, but the Spirit God is in the world, is still in control. But a sense of peace about where I am, what I control, what I should control, which is just me. A sense of acceptance, particularly a sense of thankfulness. It's so very easy. A couple of years ago, my board chair came to me and he said, you guys had a great year last year. And my response to him, of course, was, oh, but David, we didn't get to this and we didn't get this done and we should have gotten that done. And, oh, I would have loved to have gotten to this. And he said, Dennis, would you just take a few minutes and write down what the successes look like for last year? What do we have to celebrate? What are the things that really worked? So I did what you're supposed to do because I'm an executive. I typed an email to the staff and said, please send me a list of everything that we accomplished. So Rudy said I was supposed to be honest. They sent back 68 things that we had done well. That 986 kids got scholarships. That art projects flourished throughout San Antonio. That we hadn't turned the tide on child abuse, but we had started. And that many families were better. And we looked at that, we did what we always do. We boiled that down into the essential truth of it. But we came up with the 20 things that we had done in the last year that had made a sense. And it changed everything for me. But having a sense of thankfulness, having a sense of celebration, really turned the corner for me. A second thing that I need to learn in particular is a sense of humility. In essence, not listening is a basic act of idolatry of the self. Basically saying, I know what I need to know. Your story isn't going to change who I am or what I know, so allow me to think about what my argument is. Allow me to think about how I'm going to respond. Allow me how I can convince you of how smart I am. Instead of saying, allow me to learn. Allow me to learn from you. Lapita is here. She helps us with diversity and inclusion issues, doing some great work with us. But we had a group from the African American community come in, and in a very polite way, were challenging us as a large institution and saying, and I hope this is an adequate summary, but are you doing enough? Are you inclusive enough? Are you including? And I have to admit, I was telling the people, we happened to walk into one another as we walked in, but it got my heart racing. And my first thought was to say, well, okay, he is saying this, but does he know this? Does he know that? And I really had to sit back and say, I need to listen to this. It is important for me, of all people, to hear this. Because in my journey, I haven't always been as open to these thoughts as I need to be. When the Occupy Wall Street people were protesting, I thought to myself, gee, well, I had school loans and I had those sorts of issues and I paid them, so I don't get this issue. And then I read an article on 5 people. One of them was a 28-year-old woman. She had gone to school for 5 years, had $120,000 in debt. She was a nurse working with poverty-stricken people. She made $42,000 a year, and 30% of that, before anything else was taken out, went to her student loan. And it would for 12 years. The story changed everything I thought about that. The race violence we have in this country is wholly unacceptable. It's tragic. When I saw the first Black Lives Matter t-shirt I ever saw, I went up, I said, that is great. I'm so glad you're expressing that. And the fellow kind of didn't want to hear my approval of that. But there is also a truth that my first reaction to Black Lives Matters was, well, all lives matter, and white lives, yellow lives, brown. And there's truth to both of those statements. But I didn't open myself up to hearing what this movement was teaching me. I then read a book on the Underground Railroad. The degradation, the hatred, the pain suffered by slaves in this country. And all of a sudden I was mad and I was angry. And all of a sudden I began to have some small understanding of what that movement meant. I will tell you, with regard to this recent election, I don't know how Mr. Trump won the election because I've only met 4 people that voted for him. I didn't make sense, and it doesn't make sense to the pollsters. It doesn't make sense to a lot of people. I'm not taking a political view here, but I also didn't have a lot of respect for the views of those people. This will be a silly example, I admit it, but my wife had a major birthday this year. We went back to her hometown, Tulsa, and we saw Billy Joel. Wouldn't expect to achieve enlightenment at a Billy Joel concert. But they had this huge display, and they played the song Allentown. And they talked about the plants closing. They talked about young men coming back from Vietnam to a good, steady job, that 3 generations in Allentown had had good, steady jobs, and then the steel plants all moved overseas. And yet thousands of people, and he didn't say all this detail, but I'm from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. My brother lives in Allentown. But thousands of people without work. And the anger and the hurt and the pain. And so while I've said there aren't that many of those Trump folks out there and I don't understand them, I need to understand them. Because that same pain being felt by the Occupy Wall Street people, the Black Lives Matter people, is being felt by the Trump people as well. There's pain, there's hurt, there are things that I need to understand and I need to feel. And that's really the last thing I want to tell you is that I need to really listen. I need to become a sponge, not with regard to the facts of unemployment or the statistics around education, but to people's stories. Everyone's story. Listen to this if you would. This is by Laura Dotson-Renta. The most extraordinary lives are often the ones lived most quietly, most remarkably, by one's neighbors and loved ones. If we just pay attention, if you just listen, everyone has a song. It's so true. It's so true. I'm a Christian. My favorite scripture in the world is Ephesians 2:10. It begins, you are God's workmanship. In the Greek, what it really means is you are God's poetry. And so I need to open myself up listening to the poetry that other people are. On a different level, and this is from Pope Francis. Pope Francis said, if you want to find God, seek him where he is hidden, in the neediest, the sick, the hungry, the imprisoned. Last night we heard a story from a woman. I'm going to guess that she was in her late 60s. We were at an event celebrating a charity that supports needy folks. And she said, our husband didn't expect to raise 2 sets of children, but our son and our daughter both fell into difficult circumstances of their own making. And so we're raising 7 children, ages 7 through 23. And of course, my first thought was, well, 23, he's about out of the house, and that won't be too bad. And so you're getting there. And then she said, and of course, the 23-year-old is autistic. The 21-year-old is bipolar. 19-year-old is severely depressed. Long story short, the last 2 kids seem to be typical kids. But hearing those stories, feeling what a little bit of her world is like, changes me, improves me, touches me. So that's my story. That's where I'm heading. Feel free to check in with me in 3 months or 6 months or 9 months. Lapita can keep you advised, by the way. She can tell you if in meetings I've become more open, if I'm more listening, if I am more humble, if I'm more honest. But I pray I will be. Thank you.